Hi, everyone. Welcome. All right, so we will go ahead and get started. My name is Jade Domain, and I serve as one of the co-chairs of the SACAC Webinar Committee. I am joined by my co-chair, Tara Nealon, who is going to be doing some behind-the-scenes work in this webinar. So if you need anything during the presentation, Tara is the one behind the chat box. I welcome you. We welcome you to our second webinar of the season, which is The Danger of One Story, Diversity and Intersectionality. This session was originally presented at this year's Dry Run Conference, and I remember thinking at the time that it was just an incredible team to present on such an important topic, so I'm excited that this time I get to join the audience of this presentation. So now I'm going to turn things over to Sarbeth to introduce our panelists and introduce the presentation.
All right, thank you so much. Well, again, my name is Sarbeth Fleming. I will be one of the panelists today, and I'm going to allow each person to introduce themselves. And so what I will say before we start, this is a conversation where you should feel uncomfortable, right? And we are all learning. We're all in education. We do this because we love the concept of learning, growing knowledge. And so when we're talking about diversity and intersectionality, no one is an expert. Everyone has their own identity, and we are only an expert on how we define our personal identities. And so when we're talking about diversity and intersectionality, it is a time to feel uncomfortable. There is a time to learn. I learned something 2 days ago from one of my students where I said, oh, what are your preferred pronouns? And I thought I was doing great asking that question. And I love my students. She said, well, Miss Fleming, we typically don't like it when people say, what are your preferred pronouns versus what are your pronouns? Because preference means that you have a choice. And I said, well, thank you so much. Did not know that. Wrote a note, and now I know. And so this is what this presentation is about. What are places where we may have blind spots? So get to the next slide here. I moved my computer around, so sorry. All right, here we go. All right, so again, my name is Sarbeth Fleming. I am the Associate Director of College Counseling at the Westminster Schools in Atlanta, Georgia. Shannon.
Hi there, my name is Shannon Barrio. I'm the Director of College Counseling at Metairie Park Country Day in Louisiana. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm so excited to be here today.
Hi everyone, my name is Ash Haywood. I'm a Senior Admission Counselor at Agnes Scott in Decatur, Georgia. And I use both she, her, and he, him, his pronouns, interchanging between the two. I'm really excited for this session.
Hi everyone, Curtis Johnson, Assistant Director of College Counseling at Memphis University School in Memphis, Tennessee. And my pronouns are he, him, his.
So we wanted to start this presentation on a wonderful video. We are only going to show about 3 minutes of this video. If you have time, please look at the entire TED Talk. It is so educational and so informative. And so let me start that video for you.
I come from a conventional middle-class Nigerian family. My father was a professor. My mother was an administrator. And so we had, as was the norm, living domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing? So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were. so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove. What struck me was this: she had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me as an African was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. So that is how to create a single story. Show a people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and that is what they become. It is impossible to talk about the single story without talking about power. There is a word, an Igbo word, that I think about whenever I think about the power structures of the world, and it is nkali. It's a noun that loosely translates to be greater than another. Like our economic and political worlds, stories too are defined by the principle of nkali. How they are told, who tells them, when they are told, how many stories are told, are really dependent on power. Power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. The Palestinian poet Mourid Barghouti writes that if you want to dispossess a people, the simplest way to do it is to tell their story and to start with secondly. Start the story with the arrows of the Native Americans and not with the arrival of the British, and you have an entirely different story. Start the story with the failure of the African state and not with the colonial creation of the African state, and you have an entirely different story.
So like I mentioned, if you have the time, it is about a 20-minute TED Talk. Definitely take that opportunity to hear that entire TED Talk. And the major piece we wanted to take away, and a phrase that she says that is so important, well-meaning, right? No one does this out of malice, where you stereotype an entire group based off of one story. It is always well-meaning, but we need to, at this time in our lives and our career, to step away from the well-meaning and doing what's right. And doing what's right sometimes causes a lot more research, understanding. It causes that uncomfortable moment. I could have easily felt uncomfortable when the student corrected me, right? I've been in this field 20 plus years, and it was a great moment because I was able to sit down and say, teach me, tell me why, and have that understanding. And so even though it's well-meaning, we need to step away from that and grow. And sometimes with growth, it hurts. You feel uncomfortable, but it's the right thing to do.
Awesome. And so diversity, one of the things mentioned in the subject here, it is important for us to see both windows and mirrors. In my time working on the other side of the desk for the University of the South at Sewanee, had the chance to work with a diversity consultant and Alma here in a one-on-one conversation. She said this and a light bulb went off in my mind, and it just led to a really good conversation of really understanding what representation means and how we can learn so much from people who share similar signifiers and identities, but also those that are completely different. And and thinking about mentors, right? I think for me personally, I have found great mentors in Black men, but also in white women, right? And so I asked for the group to share more about their identities, right? Share more about the diversity that they welcome into the spaces that they enter, as well as their intersectionality. And so the creative mind in me asked everyone to say, all right, let's do this exercise. Let's pick a window and let's pick a mirror. And I'll let everyone speak to what their experience was in this search and seeing how we found ourselves through these images, but then also other sides of our identity. And so, Shannon?
Yeah, this was a really fun exercise for me. And when I was looking back over the presentation, I was thinking about, I mean, I always identify as a Southern white woman. That's pretty much constant. But in July, when we were preparing the presentation, I was very much in the mother, sister, auntie mode. And that was my identity. And I think about now, and my partner is caring for our children primarily, and I'm very much an educator and a counselor. And so how identities are fluid really struck me at different times throughout my life. But yeah.
So when I was looking at identities, I was thinking, you know, how do I see myself, right? And how do I define myself? What are important to me? And for me, the first identity that comes to me is being Black. Anyone who knows me, I identify so much more with being Black than anything else on my identity list. And then being a mother, if you've ever seen me at SACAC, you know the next one is where my heart is, being a fifth generation HBCU graduate. I love HBCUs, I adore, and I identify so much with that. And then the other things on my list, the last couple of pieces I put on my list, it was fascinating. I was talking to one of my coworkers today, Juana Costa, and we were looking at my identities. And it was fascinating to me to think about the identities that I don't ever think about, but people put on me. So being a single mother, being straight, I never think about those identities. But when I walk in a room, sometimes those may be the first identities that people see me. And so really thinking about how do I see myself, but how does the world view me? And so those were some of my identities.
So I have my identities listed in no particular order whatsoever. They come in and out really as I experience them with different people and different relationships. So as an auntie, you know, showing up for my niece, who is really the light of my life, is a major part of who I am. In the same way that being Black, that being a musician, inherently being creative, informs everything that I do and how I navigate this world, right? Same with being feminist and adopting a feminist practice and how I live out my life. That is deeply influenced by being queer both in regards to my gender as someone who is on the trans spectrum, but also being queer in terms of who I give love to. I'm New Orleanian. That is so core of who I am, and it feels even heightened when I'm in Atlanta, because New Orleans really represents in Atlanta. I'm a dog parent. I'm a bibliophile who loves to read and engage with reading and text. And probably the most clear thing about the way that I process things is being a Cancer. I share my feelings a heck of a lot, and I am a homebody. And that has certainly played out quite a bit, I think, especially throughout this pandemic.
Yeah, I think when we started this exercise, it was hard to say, okay, well, let's do 10. And then we realized, you know, that this list could be longer than that. And so for me, identifying as a Black man, as a believer, those who know me know that I am proud to be from Atlanta. I also am a proud member of the greatest fraternity known on this land. So happy to be an Omega man. And so, yeah, root to the blood. Others know me as a quarterback, played that throughout my life with football. Also an artist, an uncle, a budding chef. Ask those closest to me about my macaroni and cheese, fried pork chops. I'm pretty good in the kitchen. And so essentially, this exercise, I believe you can take it to your office to see what identities are around you and what signifiers you may share with your colleagues that are not necessarily visible, right? I think that's the point of the windows and mirrors.
And we all have so many more. And before we continue, I'm driving the webinar and I skipped slides by accident. So my bad. And so we'll go back to some frequent terms, Curtis, because a lot of these terms we will use in the presentation. And so we don't want to use them without the understanding.
Absolutely.
Sorry, Beth, we're still waiting for the presentation
to come up. Okay, perfect, thank you. I will share that right now. There. Is it up there now?
It is. Perfect. Yes, you have the quota and affirmative action slide.
Okay, there we go.
Awesome. Yeah, so frequently used acronyms. You realize in higher ed, we have many and more continue to be added to the list. But throughout the presentation, you may see MyPC, our community-based organizations. Of course, DEI has been a hot topic for many years, but particularly the last few months. I think that is an acronym that has been used most frequently. So diversity, equity, and inclusion, high achieving low income students, historically Black college universities, but now some institutions are being classified as Hispanic serving institutions, having that be the predominant representation of their community. PWI, predominantly white institution, POC, and then SOC, student of color.
And then another terms that have been going around most recently that we just wanted to give a base level of understanding, right? Because these two terms can be an entirely separate webinar. So quotas is a system that in 1978, the Supreme Court ruled down, and a quota is where you have a set number of individuals. If I have 100 seats and I set aside 20 seats for African-American students, that is seen as a quota because those 20 students, African-American students, can get their 20 seats, but they can also compete for the other 80 seats. Whereas if I'm a white student, I can only compete for those 80 seats. So that is what a quota is. Affirmative action is, and it's one of those things as a former teacher, I hate defining a term by using the term, but it truly is just taking that affirmative action, taking that action, going over and beyond to make others aware, people who may have been discriminated against in the past, to make them aware of opportunities. So some of the examples of affirmative action is target recruiting, coming up with different publications, coming up with going to CBOs, community-based organizations, targeted outreach programs. Affirmative action can be counted as having fly-in programs, diversity outreach programs are all a part of affirmative action because all you're doing there, you're increasing the funnel of applicants. And then the process is the same. And so at its bare bones definition, that is what affirmative action is in the higher ed part. But something that Ash is going to talk about is the California Proposition 16 and trust. As someone who used to travel to California during my recruitment in the fall, the propositions in California is a dissertation in itself, having to understand exactly what they are. I put up here, I looked at so many videos, I called friends who are in California to get a clear understanding of this proposition. And so just to give you some example of, well, bare bones information of what the proposition is, California was looking to take away or bring back affirmative action. And so that was a prop that was brought up, and Ash is going to touch a little bit more on that when later in the presentation. So now we are here.
Yeah, so during our kind of activity of mirrors and windows, we listed out identities that we share. And oftentimes when we think about identities, we put them in these specific categories, right? We think about, oh, I identify in terms of race and ethnicity, or class and socioeconomic status, religion, sexuality, gender and identity, geography, ability, political views. And this is just a short list of all the ways that we may identify, right? And the way that our identities inform the experiences that we have in life. And then oftentimes when we're looking to promote equity, we then start to target specific identities, right? We may look at Indigenous communities and how they are being served or underserved, right? How international students, first generation college students, DACA recipients, dreamers, undocumented students, rural students, thinking about their needs and how they are not met in the admission process and how they do not have access to higher education. So that's one way of looking at it. Intersectionality, however, I think is a much more progressive way, and I think useful way of really understanding how our lived experiences and identities inform each other. So instead of thinking of it as this kind of top-down list, we think about it in this visual example of Venn diagram, right? The ways that our gender and sexuality, for example, may share certain space with our ability or disability, or they may share certain space with our racial identity, right? I think about this often a lot, you know, kind of being in that upper center spot where my sexuality, gender, and racial identity are all marginalized identities, right? And they always feel at the forefront of almost every interaction that I have. What intersectionality does instead asks us to not think of these identity markers independently of each other. Instead, understanding that they each inform the others, often creating a complex convergence of oppression. So by adopting an intersectionality framework, you know, we must be aware of how identity-related circumstances may affect a student's academic performance, their behavior, and their overall well-being. And so we get the term intersectionality from Dr. Kimberle Crenshaw. She is a Black feminist theorist, and she coined this term in 1989. It's been a while for a minute, right? And so we've had the language to kind of describe this intersecting identities, although I still think that we're still starting to scratch the surface of really understanding how that plays out. And she coined this term in her article, Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a Black feminist critique of anti-discrimination practice, doctrine, feminist theory, and anti-racist politics. And so we're gonna play a video of Kimberle Crenshaw herself describing intersectionality. And she does this also in the context of education too.
Okay, y'all, I'm gonna try this video thing again and we'll see how it works out for us. Okay.
Intersectionality is just a metaphor for understanding the ways that multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage sometimes compound themselves, and they create obstacles that often are not understood within conventional ways of thinking about anti-racism or feminism or whatever social justice advocacy structures we have. Intersectionality isn't so much a grand theory, it's a prism for understanding certain kinds of problems. African-American girls are 6 times more likely to be suspended than white girls. That's probably a race and a gender problem. It's not just a race problem, and it's not just a gender problem. So I encourage people to think about how the convergence of race stereotypes or gender stereotypes might actually play out in the classroom, between teachers and students, between students and other students, between students and administrators, and commit themselves to understanding that as a way of intervening and providing equal educational opportunity for all students, regardless of their identity. Identity isn't simply a self-contained unit. It is a relationship between people in history, people in communities, people in institutions. So schools do a good job when they understand that and when they commit themselves to curricular development, to opportunities in the school for all students to understand the histories that have brought us to this particular moment. You can't change outcomes without understanding how they've come about. So independent schools can take the lead on that to be responsive to their student populations and to the communities out of which the students come.
So I think this video is helpful because it is thinking in the context of education, as I mentioned, even though this was specifically for the NAIS, right, and thinking about independent schools. I really want to highlight a major piece of how Crenshaw describes intersectionality, and particularly identity, as something that's not a self-contained unit. There's a relationship between people in history, between people in communities, people in institutions. And you cannot change outcomes without understanding how they come about. I think this reframing of how we do DEI work is really necessary, because oftentimes we consider it in the boxes, right? We put ourselves in boxes saying, okay, in this box, these are all the ways that I am oppressed, right? Or these are the ways that my oppression shows up. And then here's how I may be privileged, right? These are the things that I do not experience oppression, and maybe even the ways that oppression is perpetuated through me and through my privilege, right? And I don't think that that's a useful way of really thinking through identity. We see that no matter what identities we carry, we are all impacted by white supremacy, by misogyny, right, which is that gendered violence piece, by capitalism, which inherently is ableist, right? It tells us that our worth is based off of the productivity that we can do, right? Our worth is based off of how much profit we can make through our labor. And heterosexism also, right, focuses on the oppression and the normalcy of certain genders and certain sexualities too. We're all impacted by these things in one way or the other. And so we keep thinking about it oftentimes in these kind of very separated ways, right? Like, oh, I am able-bodied, so I don't ever really have disability play into my role or life. But I do, right? Because when I become ill for whatever amount of time, I then have to make a lot of compromises in order to show up for my work, right? And that is a very, specific and temporary moment of understanding that lens, but it is something that affects us all equally. And I think we especially see that too when we think about this election, right? And we think about how maybe sometimes people vote against their own interests, right? Even things that, because we may feel affinity for, because of identity, because of background, still does not necessarily advance us, right, as a society. And so my proposal for how to actually progress is to use an intersectional lens for pluralism. And I use pluralism instead of diversity or instead of inclusion because it allows for so many different experiences, so many different strengths, and so many different visions of how to make this world a better place to exist all in the same place, right? We don't have to fight against or compete for a specific vision. And so step one of this is to really listen, to recognize the unique experiences of those whose identities are at the intersection of multiple oppressions, right? This means listening to the people in your circles, in your communities, in your office, listening to your students. It also means listening to people who you may not regularly interact with and also interrogating, why don't you interact with them? Why aren't you in community with them? During the dry run session of this, we did this simulation that was done by Kate Kirby, who is a PhD student at Vanderbilt, but she did this simulation of what fall 2020 looks like in the light of COVID in person, in the perspective of a Black disabled who uses a wheelchair student who is from Atlanta, and experienced everything in the summer of the uprisings that happen in terms of racial inclusion and diversity. So I encourage you to maybe play around with that. I think it's a fun game. But that's step one. Then step two is to then center those voices, the voices of those who are most impacted by intersecting oppressions, and to then prioritize their well-being to make change and to foster this pluralist community, right? That means that, if we look at Black feminism as a whole, as a study, as a theory, in which, we get the language of intersectionality, Black feminism teaches us that if we meet the needs of those who are most disadvantaged first, by meeting all of those needs, all of those housing needs, all of their healthcare needs, all of their educational needs, all of these kind of naturally endowed rights that they should have, then inherently we're going to meet the needs of everyone else in our society, right? And so that's what intersectionality, I think, can offer a really good entryway into DEI work, is to really start to recenter, not just, how can we support these one-off identities, but how can we support them as a whole?
Curtis, were you going to take this slide before barriers?
I think, yes. When we connected yesterday, Shannon was still under the notes section. So, but yeah, campus culture and thinking about diversity, intersectionality, identities. It is important for you to know your own community. Thinking about your office community, but also thinking about the campus, right? I think speaking to two different demographics in high school and the college side of things. So the curricular offerings, thinking about the equity and what type of education you are providing in the fullness of perspective with that education. How does your institution define diversity, right? So Ash mentioned those boxes, right? Sort of breaking down the barriers to eliminating those boxes. I was having a great conversation with a colleague about frustration with the term underrepresented, minorities, right? And so that led me to think about, who is really underrepresented on, your particular campus. That might not be the same for the institution down the road or the institution, across the country. So seeing where your community can improve its resources for the people that it is serving or want to serve. There's a student experience for different identities, surveying the students to see what their level of comfort is and how their signifiers play a role in enjoying their experience, right? I think from my experience in attending a small, rural, predominantly white institution, as a Black man, one of the things was always a haircut, right? And so now you had our friends trying to figure out, okay, how can we continue to look good, essentially? I'm just gonna say that blunt, right? Because it's almost a spiritual experience in the community, going to get your hair cut. And so you have, your best friend with shaky hands, maybe take your line back, and now that affects your not only your appearance, but your mood in attending class, right? You don't feel as good as you want to because of that appearance. How is your institution working to improve hiring and supporting a diverse admissions team, right? Going back to the exercise of windows and mirrors, it's important for the families that you're wanting to invite to your campus kind of see representation or at least an understanding of their representation in the communication of recruitment.
One thing I'll add to this is about the diversity in the diverse, right? Because I mentioned I love HBCUs. I'm a proud HBCU graduate, but a lot of times people hear that and use one paintbrush, right? There's so much diversity in the diverse. That was the first time I learned really of classism. You still have sexism. You still have a lot of isms, even though you are on a photo shoot, everybody may look pretty much the same or similar. But when you peel back and say, who is this person? There's a lot of diverse in the diverse. And what happens so many times is that we pick one identity, we put it on the student and their entire population, and we market it to the one identity we've selected for that student. And so if that's not an identity that is my primary identity, I'm thinking that school, that college counselor, that administration person knows nothing about me. Yes.
And so this slide and preparing this presentation, it's somewhat evolved in thinking about, well, pre-COVID and, you know, COVID now and afterwards. And so barriers to access and admission, you think about campus visits, right? And I think the past few months, many institutions have wrestled with, you know, accommodating visitors, sort of filling this void of this loss of seeing the campus, because we know how important or how crucial that is. And it has led us to really seeing sort of access virtually. Right, but we also have to think about screen fatigue or Zoom fatigue, particularly for students who might be experiencing a hybrid model. Are they fully remote and distance learning? And so if they're in class for 7-8 hours a day, and you know your institution is, you know, counting on demonstrated interest, are they really able to join that webinar, that Zoom presentation at the end of the day, right? So evaluating how you might capture students' interest, my gosh, that's pretty lofty, right? But it's something to be thinking about. So the pre-COVID, thinking about reimbursement for fly-ins, not everyone having access to maybe pay up front to attend campus, but working with families and their needs. And thinking about a world of test scores. Our institutions offering students to self-report or attached to documents, just truly being flexible to not limit, you know, any opportunities or any thing that would hurt in the overall evaluation process. You have to think about lack of counseling and advising and programming for students across the country. We know there are some secondary schools that do not have ample help for the caseload, hundreds of students assigned to one counselor. And then thinking about, you know, poorly designed college websites that bury important information. Or I know many institutions have moved to translating their websites to Spanish and other, again, I think languages that really serve the populations of the students that are most interested in their institution. And so those are things that I think are important for us to consider in this work together.
Okay, so when we think about the student experience and how different identities are supported on campus, you can seek out students who identify differently from you and ask them directly about their experience, and think about who these spaces, who your community was created for. And if you change the lens and assume different identities, what is that experience? So as a trans student, what are your housing options and how easily can you access gender neutral bathrooms? I was thinking about a student in the class of 2020. I had a blind student who was very frustrated when she returned from campus visits, thinking about the lack of ability awareness in where the learning centers were located. And sometimes they were on the second floor and she really struggled with that. A good exercise for learning about your community is just to take a walk around your campus, whether that's a high school or a university, and see how, assuming different identities, see how long it takes you to find representation, and take note of that and who is being represented. And if you were of a different identity, would you feel welcome on this campus? For me, working at a predominantly white high school, the Black at Instagram pages have been really helpful. Finding out the Black experience on independent school campuses, but also on college campuses, rather than asking your colleagues of color to kind of explain what that experience might be. It's a really good resource to see, how Black students are navigating predominantly white campuses. Yeah, I think the next slide, we can go to the next slide. Okay, diversity, intersectionality, and inclusion. I think that we've been talking about those words a lot, and they get thrown out a lot, but what do they really mean? And I really think when we talk about diversity, a lot of institutions are thinking about numbers, and fulfilling certain numbers of students that meet different identities. But really, when we're talking about inclusion, how are those students supported on your campus? What is it's a measure of culture that enables diversity to thrive. And then when it comes to inclusion, intersectionality identifies that one size approach does not fit all. So I think that's what we've been talking about, is that you really have to think about the broader spectrum of how broader identities intersect. I think it's important to mention that diversity and inclusion work is not the sole responsibility of our colleagues of color, although it often falls on that person in your office that might identify as non-white and do intercultural recruitment, but it really is everyone's job to be able to relate to all students. And this might look like supporting events, diversity fly-ins that maybe your diversity and inclusion officer has planned, and kind of really reaching out to support those events, even if you were not assigned to do that. And then challenge stereotyped territory assignments. When you're looking at where you're recruiting, what is that, take an honest look at what that looks like. If you are a white person assigned to all white schools, you have some flexibility in directing who you'll visit. So make some time to really connect with maybe community-based organizations, and get out of your comfort zone to recruit students that maybe don't look like you, or that you don't most identify with. I think in independent schools, oftentimes students of color or families of color will be guided to maybe a counselor of color. But it's really important for all counselors to be able to meet the needs of all of their students and families. Being mindful of the spaces where events are held is really important. How welcoming do students of different identities feel coming to admissions events at a country club? Or if you're hosting an event at an independent school that's open to the public, is that comfortable for all students? Perhaps you could use a neutral event space that is mindful of access. Yeah, and I think that, to close up with, I wanted to, if you get a chance to watch the full TED Talk of Chimamanda Adichie, she talks about having grown up on stories, British and American children's stories. And she speaks that when she started writing her own stories, that she would write about things like snow and eating apples and drinking ginger beer. And, she thought later that in Nigeria, she had never seen snow and she had grown up eating mangoes, and she had no idea what ginger beer is. So if you only view a community through one lens, you risk stereotyping into that single story. And I think that we just want to open a perspective of recognizing the complexity of identities and how they intersect with each other on our campus and in our offices.
And one thing that I'll also say about the intersectionality piece is keep in mind that Ash mentioned this, there's so much that when you are in populations that are marginalized populations, but you identify with multiple. I remember once, many moons ago, when I was in school, and a professor was just so hard on me, and I went to now one of my mentors, who was the dean at the time, and I said, I don't think he likes me because I'm Black, right? Because that's the only background-ism I had. And it sounds harsh, but we're all adults. And he said, no, it's because of your socioeconomic background. He's a little classist. And at that point, I was like, oh, okay. And so now that got me in the habit now of when something happens, I have to run through so many different levels, right? Is this racism? Is this sexism? Is this classism? Or am I just wrong? And so knowing that I have to go through all of that each time, it's a weight on a lot of people's shoulders. Sometimes maybe I am wrong, but other times there may be an ism that I wasn't even aware of. And so being mindful even when you're working with community-based organizations, right? Not all are created the same. Some people, and even on the Common app now, it has community-based organization. Well, what is one of the options? A Better Chance, KIP. We know those terms pretty much. But then also another option is Jack and Jill, which is a community-based organization, true, but has a very different background, very different population, group of individuals. And so as a college, as an organization, if we're sending that same marketing information to all CBOs, you're missing the mark. And so, like Shannon said, really researching and knowing your population. One thing that that SACAC is going to do, and I'm just going to put in a plug, is a book discussion on the book, The Privileged Poor, which I think is an amazing book. It gives people the terminology of looking at students from different schools and saying, okay, even though these populations look the same, again, what is the background? What is the intersectionality? How am I marketing? How am I helping students? And so one thing to take away from the presentation, I really think it is you have to step back and stop putting identities on your students, putting identities on your colleagues, but listening to what identities they put on themselves and operating in that space, because that's how you are going to be able to grow and learn. You may be uncomfortable, right? But growing and learning so that it's not just well-meaning, but it's well-action work, because you've done the research and you have that, you've taken a vested interest to really know what you're doing versus using the stereotype. Okay.
I think we could probably move to the Q&A section. That was just a reminder for the campus simulation as well. I know that we quickly went over legal precedents, and one of the things that I forgot to mention in terms of Proposition 16 with California, and also just thinking about the election overall, is once again, like whose voices do we center when making these decisions, right? I think this election showed a lot of division and also a lot of unity at the same time, and there's so much learning lessons that we can take from this. But I think what's interesting is even in a blue liberal state, as we make California out to be, that proposition, which would have aided affirmative aid and ensuring that University of California schools will continue to prioritize access for students of color, that was voted down, right? It did not pass. And so I think we need to pay attention as well of the things that are serving against some of the most marginalized communities. So I think we now have time for Q&A. And so we're also keeping our eye on the chat, but if questions do come in, please put them in the Q&A box and we'll go through them.
I don't see any questions yet, but what I will say while we're looking to see if there's any questions, working on the high school side, I will tell you that identities is a hard, if you've never thought about your identity, it's a hard place to start thinking of your identity. I tell my students when I walk in a room, since I was 2, I see myself as a Black girl, a Black female. And so many times that identity question on Common App, particularly populations who have never felt marginalized, will say, oh, well, I don't have an identity, or I don't have a cultural identity. What should I write about? And it's like, if you're breathing, you have an identity. So let's think about that. And so if you listened to the webinar and you thought about it, and hopefully you enjoyed it, and you're like, oh, that's a great information for, you know, Black students, Asian students, Latinx students, female students, LGBTQA identifying students, and you feel like you don't fall into any of those categories, you don't have diversity without every category. And so think about that own identity. I think it was great when we created this presentation of when we sat down and had to come up with our identifiers, right? And it was like, oh, like I saw Ash put auntie, and I was like, oh, I'm an auntie too. Yes, I love my nieces and nephews. And so really thinking about that piece of identity. And if you're on the college side, when you're asking that question, what are you hoping to gain, right? And because it is, for the students who think about their identity, they're like, great, I got something. But students who have never thought about their identity, it is something that actually is really hard. And so thinking about that identity, thinking about, Curtis mentioned the fly-in programs, and having certain students who will say, well, my family's not low socioeconomically challenged, can I participate in the fly-in program? And then having to email the colleges or really try to dig down, is this a fly-in for students of color, or is this a fly-in for students of color who are on a low socioeconomic background? And so looking at, as a college or an organization may think this is a diversity fly-in, what exactly are you trying to attract to apply to that diversity fly-in, and being very meaningful and mindful with your words. Oh, okay. Let's see, there's a question there. Great questions in the chat. Do any of you want to grab one? I'll mention Bianca's question. Are there any online resources that we would recommend to help students or even with colleagues evaluate and define their identities? I've been at a couple of different colleges that have had a program or an exercise where, one in particular, when I was in New England, we got together, it was doing a retreat, and everyone stood in a circle, and it's the step in. So if I mention an identity that you identify with, step into the circle. And it was fascinating to just see how the movements were, how people you thought would step in didn't, and people just the movements, and we had discussion. I think anytime you have an exercise like that, if you don't have a discussion, then you're just singling people out, right? And everyone was given the option of not stepping. And so just because you didn't move didn't mean that you identified or not. We were told if you felt comfortable, and that was really helpful with colleagues. We've done that, and actually at one college, they did it with a group of students, and that was always a helpful presentation.
I see one question up here that I think has a lot in it, and I'd love for us to start to like take it apart a bit, right? Some of the questions include, you know, do your students of color and their parents expect to speak with someone like them? Do they feel more comfortable? And I think, you know, that question around who can serve these students of color, who can serve these queer students, these disabled students, or students with different abilities, it is important. And I think the identity that we have when we serve these students is important. And I also think we need to continue to be student-centered in everything that we do, right? And I say that because I work at an institution where students are already aware, hyper aware of the way that their gender identity, especially because we are a women's college, but oftentimes the way that their racial identity, their socioeconomic identity, and all of the other experiences that they've had have impacted their education. They are super aware of this, and they make it known again and again throughout their application and throughout their interviews. And I notice also that students tend to, trans students especially, tend to want to be open with me. And I don't know if that's in comparison with other colleagues, you know, in my office, but I can see it and I can feel it, that they are searching for a mentor, that they are searching for someone to finally listen to them and then to guide them through this experience. I also, you know, want us to remember and recenter once again that this admission process is an educational process in and of itself. It's a process of self-reflection and self-discovery, and then starting to identify what are our needs as individuals, what are our educational needs, and how can institutions support them. And so I recognize I'm not exactly answering this question, but it does make an impact. Yes, students do, when they see themselves with someone, they are ready to open up. That layer of protection, of defense that they have up, because that is what all of their lived experiences, their high school experiences especially, have taught them to do. It goes down, and they're able to kind of put down, be a little bit more vulnerable through this process. And that is not to say that white people can't do this work. They can, absolutely. That's not to say that cis people can't do this work. Able-bodied people can do this work. They absolutely can. I also recognize my privilege as a citizen, and I work with students sometimes, you know, who's not necessarily whose citizenships, you know, is not within the US, but that it's murkier, right? The type of endowed rights that we have as citizens are a huge change and impact. And so I encourage the person who asked this question especially to think a little bit more about the students and put yourself in their shoes, right? You also put the kind of perspective of socioeconomic level, right, have impacted your educational experiences. Yeah, imagine what happens with a student who has no resources, comes to a college that costs $50,000+ a year. What are the fears that they have? How are they maybe second guessing themselves in their own work when they show up to your institution? So I encourage you to put yourselves in their shoes a little bit more.
There was one statement that I wanted to read out loud, if I can get back to it. And I'm not saying we necessarily have the answer, but what I love about this question is that I think we all should be reflective and think about what the answer is. I'm a white guy, grew up with a single mom on welfare, food stamps, free lunch, who has been involved with recruiting students of color since 1986. About that time, colleges realized that they needed to concentrate on this population. And I've noticed that colleges really are sort of racist, as most colleges run by white, middle to upper class income men who have specific ideas that you need a person of color to recruit a student of color. I have literally been turned down for diversity recruiting more than once because of my color, and I was told so. And so I think this is where Ash was picking up. Do your students of color and their parents expect to speak with someone like them? Do they feel more comfortable? I've never had any problems with students or parents. They have respected my desire to help them. And I will, just adding on to what Ash said, I definitely don't think you have to be a person of color to recruit a person of color. I used to recruit in Salt Lake City, Utah. And when I went, I knew how many wards, how many states. That is all with the Mormon Church. I knew I could give names, I could give contacts, because that was my job, to recruit all students. And so when I went to a certain population or geographic location, I did the research to know what those questions were going to be. But I do think what Ash and what Curtis showed with the mirror and the image, sometimes families want to find someone with a similar experience to ask those questions. And so even if you are not a person of color, recruiting a person of color, even people will look at a website and reach out to however they define their comfort level. I know some colleges now are posting if an admissions counselor is first generation. And so there's, again, that group or that family sometimes wants to find that identifying connection. Yeah, right. So I think we are at 1 o'clock. There are some phenomenal questions on here. Anybody else want to add anything? But thank you so much. Hopefully this is the beginning of a conversation. Dr. Crenshaw has phenomenal web YouTube videos. If you want to know more about intersectionality, my high school seniors this year, I found a 3-minute cartoon on YouTube to really break down what intersectionality was. So there's a lot of resources out there, but knowing that defining or identifying a person is more than just one word or one box. It is who makes them from every piece, every being of that person.
And also, I mean, our contact information is available. So the conversation does not have to end right now, you know, so please feel free, at least I'll speak for myself, you know, that I am welcome to help how I can.
Absolutely.
Thank you for sharing that, Curtis. Yes, there were so many questions. I wish this could last all day so that all of our questions could get answered. I encourage you to continue engaging. So we have another webinar that's going to occur in December called Why Allies Great Till They Gotta Be Great, Part 2. Shannon is actually going to be joining for that one too, or presenting for that one too. It's a follow-up to the conversation that happened over the summer. So if you're looking for more professional development, more ways to talk about this inclusion conversation, that's a really great way. Sorry, Beth, can you remind us the dates for the book discussions? Okay,
that would be amazing. Yes, I probably should know that off the top of my head. And yes.
No worries. This happens to me when students ask me when certain events are. I'm like, yes, I should know that.
Okay, so there is one on November 19th at 6:30 Eastern Standard Time. I knew we were going to do one before and one out. And the second one is December 3rd, 7:30 Eastern Standard Time. And they are about the book, The Privileged Poor. Oh, good. Ashley, you can put that in you got it. I'm looking at my chats for my co-presenter, Ashley Armano. We're doing the book club together. It's called The Privileged Poor. And when I tell you, it is an amazing book. I've been in this profession for over 20 years, and just some of the terminology that it has helped me. And so it's not a 2-part. We're going to do the book series twice. And so that gives individuals the opportunity to chat in. SACAT sent out that registration form November 19th and December 3rd. Yes, I was correct. Thank you, Ashley. And so you can register for that. Yes.
Thank you. So I want to say thank you for all of our attendees for attending, for your questions, for your engagement. And I especially want to thank our panelists for their leadership and vulnerability as you talked about your identities and your mistakes and you shared your stories in this presentation. And thank you for reminding us to stay uncomfortable in these really important conversations. So thank you, everyone. We hope to see you at our next webinar. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.